Hey guys, tonight we step straight into a medieval winter evening, and you are standing barefoot on packed earth as the light dies early and the cold arrives like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave, creeping through the cracks before you even sit down, and you can already tell that you probably won't survive this if you're expecting central heating, fluffy duvets, or even basic insulation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what the local time is, because right now, your night is about to sync up with one from centuries ago. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because winter has officially arrived and you are a medieval peasant facing the coldest nights of your life, nights that feel longer than modern work weeks and colder than your phone screen when it slips out of your hand at 3 a.m. You live in a world where winter is not a vibe or an aesthetic, but a season that quietly threatens your survival. And as the first frosts harden the ground outside, you already feel the shift in your bones, because medieval people genuinely believed cold could seep directly into the body and stay there, which is partly why surviving winter is as much about routine as it is about fear management. You shut the wooden door behind you, and it never really shuts, because gaps are everywhere, letting the wind whistle softly like it's testing how alert you are. And this is normal, because medieval houses are built to breathe rather than seal, a design choice that makes sense in summer and feels like betrayal in January. The sun sets absurdly early, something you notice more keenly without artificial light, and historians still argue whether medieval people experienced winter as more psychologically brutal than physically harsh. But standing here, in the darkening room, you feel both stacking up at once. You are already planning the night in your head, not in hours but in heat, calculating how long the fire might last, how close you can sit without singeing your clothes, and how much cold you can tolerate before your fingers stop working properly, which is a real concern when numb hands mean spilled food, dropped tools, and mistakes you cannot afford. The year might be around the 13th century, deep in what scholars later call the medieval warm period's slow decline, a time when winters are growing more unpredictable, sometimes mild, sometimes shockingly cruel, and nobody has the language yet to call it climate change, but everyone feels it. Outside, the village is settling into silence, animals shifting in their pens, people retreating indoors, not for comfort, but for defense, because night magnifies the cold, and cold magnifies everything else, including hunger, illness, and fear. You pull your cloak tighter, wool scratching your neck, and you remind yourself that wool is a gift here, even when it's coarse and smells faintly of sheep, because unlike linen, it still insulates when damp, a fact medieval people understand through experience long before science explains it. Somewhere in the back of your mind, there's a half-remembered belief that spirits roam more freely in winter darkness, a quirky blend of Christian teaching and older folklore that says cold nights thin the veil between worlds, and you try not to think about that too much as the shadows stretch. This is not a dramatic blizzard night, not yet, just the beginning of winter's grip, the kind that wears you down slowly, night after night. And that's what makes it dangerous, because survival here is about endurance, not heroics. You are already tired, because winter means more darkness and less energy, and medieval people absolutely notice this seasonal fatigue, even if they don't call it depression, and you feel it now as a heaviness behind your eyes. The coldest nights are still ahead, but this is where the story begins, with you standing in a dim room, listening to the wind test your walls, understanding on a very basic level that from now until spring, every night is something you have to get through, not sleep through, and that surviving medieval winter will mean adapting your body, your habits, and your expectations in ways that would horrify your modern self, who is already missing a heated blanket and wondering how people ever did this voluntarily. You wake before dawn, not because you want to, but because the cold nudges you awake, a persistent reminder that your house is not a sealed box, but a living thing full of small mouths that breathe, sigh, and whisper air in and out all night long. And as you pull your cloak tighter, you understand why medieval homes are built this way, with wattle and daub walls and timber frames meant to flex and dry rather than trap moisture. A sensible choice in a damp world, even if it feels like sleeping inside a sieve during winter. You stand and feel the floor bite back through your soles, packed earth or rough planks stealing heat with quiet efficiency, and you shuffle toward the hearth, stepping around the places where smoke stains the beams above. Because smoke never fully leaves, it just hangs around like a permanent house guest. The roof above you is thatched, layered straw tied down tight, excellent insulation when dry, and an absolute menace when sparks jump, and you've learned to live with both truths at once, because complaining doesn't make the wind stop finding the seams. You notice the way the door sits slightly crooked in its frame, how light peeks through the edges when day finally comes, and this is not poor craftsmanship so much as intentional tolerance, wood swelling and shrinking with seasons, a flexibility that keeps structures standing for decades. Historians still argue whether peasants felt their homes as protective shelters or as porous extensions of the outdoors, but right now it feels like the latter, as if the night has one foot inside with you. There is a small window, maybe shuttered, maybe oiled cloth, stretched over a frame, letting in just enough gray light to prove the world still exists, and you're reminded that glass is rare and precious, something churches and great halls show off, not something you expect in a working home. You breathe in and catch the mixed scent of damp earth, smoke, and old straw, a smell that modern candles try to imitate and never quite get right. And you realize that smell is part of warmth here, because a dry house smells different from a wet one, and your nose learns to worry before your mind does. The walls themselves are thick but imperfect, clay cracking as it dries, patched again and again by hands that know winter will exploit every flaw, and there's a quiet pride in those patches, because they mean someone noticed in time. You remember hearing that medieval houses leak by design, allowing smoke to escape and fresh air to circulate, reducing suffocation long before chimneys become standard. And while that's technically a mainstream historical understanding, it doesn't make your fingers any warmer. Somewhere above, mice scurry in the thatch, unbothered by cold, and there's an oddly comforting thought that if they can survive up there, you probably can too, though you'd prefer not to trade places. A quirky belief floats through your head, something about certain woods keeping out evil winds, and you glance at the beams, wondering if the carpenter chose oak for strength or superstition, because medieval builders often blend both without bothering to separate them. You sit close to the hearth, careful not to block airflow completely, because stale air is its own danger, and you think about how modern homes chase airtight perfection, while medieval ones accept constant negotiation with the elements, a philosophy that feels strangely honest at 3 a.m. The cold pools in corners and crawls along the floor, forcing you to adapt your posture, perching like a bird rather than sprawling, and you joke to yourself that this is medieval yoga, all about minimizing surface area and maximizing survival. You notice how sound travels differently at night, wind sneaking through gaps, creating low whistles that become familiar enough to lull you. And when a new sound appears, you pay attention, because change means trouble. There's no ceiling in the modern sense, just open rafters where heat rises and disappears, and you briefly wonder if the house is sighing as it cools, wood contracting, fibers tightening, a slow nighttime breath. You think about how future centuries will seal homes tighter and tighter, trapping warmth and smells and secrets. And you wonder if they'll miss this strange intimacy with weather, this awareness of every shift outside. For now, you make peace with the drafts, nudging furniture where it helps, hanging cloth where it matters, because surviving cold nights is not about winning, but about negotiating terms. And as the sky lightens slightly, you realize that your house, imperfect as it is, has carried you through another night, breathing alongside you, just enough. The fire greets you like an old friend who is also slightly unhinged, because in a medieval peasant's life, the hearth is warmth, light, food, and danger all bundled into one glowing center. And as you crouch close, you feel that familiar push and pull, the heat licking your shins while your back remains cold enough to remind you not to get complacent. You feed the fire carefully, not tossing wood, but placing it, because fuel is precious and sparks are treacherous, and you've seen what happens when a thatched roof catches, a whole life erased faster than you can shout for help, which is why villages are packed with stories of families who survived famine only to lose everything to flame. The hearth sits in the middle of the house or against one wall, open and smoky, and there's no chimney yet in most places, just a hole in the roof or a loose path for smoke to find its own way out, which means your eyes sting and your lungs learn to tolerate irritation as part of warmth. It's a mainstream historical truth that many medieval homes rely on open hearths well into the later Middle Ages, and you feel that truth in the way smoke stains the beams and settles into your clothes, a scent that marks you as indoors even when you step outside. You warm your hands slowly, rotating them like bread over a toaster, because sudden heat can hurt numb skin, something you've learned the hard way, and you quietly laugh at yourself for knowing that without ever reading it anywhere. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants suffered long-term lung damage from constant smoke inhalation or whether their bodies adapted over generations, and as you cough softly, you suspect the answer might be a bit of both. The fire crackles and pops, occasionally sending a spark skittering across the floor, and you instinctively stamp it out, heart jumping, because everyone knows at least one tale of a spark that wasn't caught in time. You keep water or sand nearby, not because it's written anywhere, but because someone once told you to, and it stuck. And this is how safety knowledge travels here, person to person, story to story. The wood you burn matters too, hardwoods lasting longer and burning hotter, softer woods flaring up fast, and you know which to use at night when you want steady warmth rather than spectacle, because spectacle is for festivals, not survival. There's a quirky belief that certain woods bring bad luck or restless spirits into the house when burned, and even if you tell yourself that's nonsense, you still avoid them when you can, because winter nights are long enough without inviting imaginary guests. You notice how the fire becomes a gathering point, bodies drifting closer, stools nudged in, everyone negotiating personal space in exchange for shared heat, and you realize that warmth reorganizes social life in winter, pulling people together whether they like it or not. You time your cooking to the fire's rhythm, letting stews simmer for hours, because slow heat extracts more nourishment and keeps the room warmer longer, a happy coincidence you depend on. At night, you bank the fire, raking embers together and covering them with ash, hoping they'll survive until morning, because starting a new fire from scratch is work and risk both, and waking to dead embers feels like a small failure. You remember hearing that fire is alive, something that must be fed and respected, and while you wouldn't phrase it that way formally, you understand the sentiment as you watch it change, shape, and mood with every log. There's a joke you make to yourself about how this is medieval central heating, one setting only, occasionally trying to kill you, and it makes you smile despite the cold, because humor helps stretch endurance. Outside, the wind picks up, and you feed the fire just enough to counter it, listening to the sound shift as warmth pushes back against cold, a quiet tug of war you referee all night. The hearth also marks time, flames shrinking as hours pass, shadows crawling across walls, and without clocks, you measure the night in how often you need to tend it, how tired your eyes feel, how close dawn might be. You think about how fire brings community and danger in equal measure, how it makes winter survivable and life fragile, and as you settle beside it, eyelids heavy, you accept that tonight, like every cold night, survival depends on this glowing, unpredictable companion staying just friendly enough until morning. By the time you turn away from the fire, your thoughts drift to clothing, because what you wear to bed in winter is not about fashion or comfort, but about building a portable shelter around your body, and you start layering with the practiced routine of someone who knows cold intimately, pulling on wool over linen, then more wool, because medieval warmth is cumulative and forgiving only if you plan ahead. The linen closest to your skin is smooth but thin, there to protect the outer layers from sweat and oils, because even in winter, bodies produce moisture, and dampness is the real enemy here, a fact you understand instinctively every time cold fabric touches you. Over that comes wool, rough, itchy, sometimes unevenly spun, but dependable in a way few things are, because it traps air even when slightly wet, and that trapped air is what keeps you alive through nights that seem determined to pry warmth out of your bones. There's a mainstream historical understanding that wool dominates medieval wardrobes for exactly this reason, and as you tug a heavy tunic over your head, you silently thank the sheep that made it possible, even if the smell never quite washes out. You add stockings, maybe leg wraps, binding them carefully because loose fabric lets cold sneak in, and you're aware that every gap is a negotiation point, a place where winter will try to win. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants slept fully clothed or partially undressed in winter, but standing here shivering, you cannot imagine stripping down voluntarily, so you err on the side of caution and keep everything on, because hypothermia is not a concept you name, but a sensation you recognize. You wrap yourself in a cloak too, doubling its purpose from outdoor garment to nighttime insulation, and you laugh quietly at how medieval multitasking works, one object doing 5 jobs because you don't own enough things for specialization. The wool scratches, and you shift, telling yourself that irritation is a small price to pay for warmth, a mantra you repeat often in winter, applying it to everything from food to sleep. There's a quirky belief floating around that certain dyes make cloth warmer or colder, darker colors supposedly holding heat better, and while you don't have the luxury of testing theories, you do notice that your darker cloak feels marginally cozier, whether from physics or placebo, you're not sure. You pull a cap down over your ears because heat escapes from the head quickly, a truth medieval people know long before modern studies confirm it, and you think about how silly you once felt wearing a hat indoors, a concept that now feels laughable in its absence. Your hands are still cold, fingers stiff, so you tuck them under your arms or into folds of fabric, using your own body heat strategically, because gloves are rare and often impractical indoors. You consider your footwear, leather shoes, thin and flexible, good for working, but terrible for insulation, and you decide to keep them on, stuffing straw inside for extra padding. A simple trick passed down through generations because it works. Straw shifts as you move, rustling softly, and you make a mental note to change it regularly, because damp straw becomes a sponge for cold, and neglect is how small problems grow teeth. There's a light joke you tell yourself about medieval fashion, influencers insisting wool is in this winter, and the absurdity helps you relax, shoulders dropping slightly as your layers settle. You notice how dressing like this changes how you move, stiffening joints, slowing gestures, and you accept it, because winter is not the season for haste, and rushing only makes mistakes. You think about children and elders in similar layers, smaller bodies losing heat faster, and you feel a quiet urgency to keep everyone bundled, to adjust scarves and wraps, because survival is collective here, not individual. The room smells faintly of lanolin and smoke, and you associate that smell with safety, a sensory anchor that tells your nervous system you've done what you can. You test your setup by stepping away from the fire, standing in the cooler part of the room, and you assess honestly whether your clothing can hold up through the night, because there will be hours when the hearth dims and the cold creeps closer. Satisfied enough, you return to your sleeping place, feeling bulky and awkward but protected, and you reflect that medieval warmth is never about eliminating cold, only about dulling its edge, about making it tolerable enough that sleep becomes possible. As you settle down, wrapped in layers that itch, weigh, and press, you understand that clothing here is not an accessory but armor. And tonight, like every winter night, you trust this humble, woolen defense to hold the line until morning. When it's finally time to sleep, you realize that warmth is no longer a solo project, because medieval winter quietly rewrites the rules of personal space, and you find yourself edging closer to others without ceremony, bodies aligning like logs stacked for efficiency, each person's heat a small but meaningful contribution to the group's survival. You settle beside family members or fellow laborers, the arrangement practical rather than sentimental, because shared warmth matters more than modesty when the cold gnaws all night, and this closeness feels normal in a world where privacy is already a luxury. There's a mainstream historical understanding that medieval households often slept together in single rooms, and sometimes even in shared beds, especially during winter, and as you feel another person's shoulder press against yours, you understand why this practice persists despite later generations wrinkling their noses at the idea. You adjust carefully, finding a position that lets you share heat without cutting off circulation, because numb limbs are the enemy of rest, and you've learned through trial and error how to negotiate comfort in close quarters. Historians still argue whether bed sharing was primarily about warmth, social bonding, or economic necessity. But from where you're lying, shivering less than you would alone, the answer feels obvious and immediate. You hear breathing around you, slow and uneven, a collective rhythm that becomes oddly soothing, like waves lapping against a shore, and you match your own breath to it without thinking. Someone shifts, blankets rustle, straw mattresses compress and release, and you accept these sounds as part of nighttime, a far cry from modern expectations of silence but comforting in their predictability. There's a quirky belief that sleeping alone invites bad dreams or wandering spirits, and while you wouldn't say you fully believe it, you notice that the presence of others makes the dark feel less crowded, as if fear itself needs space to grow. You tuck your feet under another person's calves, an unspoken arrangement that benefits both of you, and you smile faintly at how human bodies become infrastructure in winter, heat sources as valuable as any hearth. The bedding is simple, maybe a wool blanket or two, heavy and slightly stiff, and you pull it up over everyone as best you can, because gaps are where cold waits patiently. You think briefly about bed bugs or lice, an ever-present reality, and you decide not to dwell on it, because worrying doesn't make them go away, and sleep is more urgent than itchiness right now. There's a light, sleepy joke in your mind about medieval sleepovers being mandatory, and it helps you relax into the arrangement, shoulders unclenching as warmth slowly builds. Children are nestled in the middle, where heat concentrates, elders positioned where they can be protected and adjusted easily, and you see how winter reorganizes family structure, placing vulnerability at the center rather than the margins. Outside, the wind rattles something loose, and someone murmurs half awake, but no one fully stirs, because your bodies have learned which sounds matter and which can be ignored to preserve energy. You feel the mattress beneath you, straw and cloth shifting, not luxurious but functional, lifting you slightly off the cold ground, and you silently appreciate that small mercy. As minutes pass, the cold recedes to a dull presence, still there, but no longer sharp, and you understand that shared warmth is cumulative, each body adding a degree or two, enough to tip the balance from misery to endurance. You remember hearing that medieval moralists sometimes worried about impropriety in shared beds, but you also know winter doesn't care about sermons, and survival always outranks ideology when temperatures drop. Your thoughts slow, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, and you notice how the group breathes more deeply as everyone warms, a sign that the strategy is working. In this closeness, there's a quiet trust, an agreement that tonight you'll all contribute what heat you can and take what you need, because tomorrow we'll ask the same of you again. As your eyes finally close, you feel the strange comfort of being part of a living bundle, and you accept that in medieval winter, together is warmer than alone, and that is reason enough to let sleep take you. Sometime in the night, you become aware of a new layer of warmth, not from another human body, but from something larger, heavier, and unmistakably alive, because in winter, the line between household and barn blurs, and you are sharing your space with animals whose body heat is too valuable to waste, even if their manners leave much to be desired. A cow shifts nearby, hooves scraping softly against packed earth, and the sound is oddly reassuring, because where there is livestock, there is warmth, breath fogging the air, slow and steady like a living bellows. It's a mainstream, historical reality that peasants often brought animals indoors or attached living quarters directly to stalls, especially in colder regions, and as the temperature lifts ever so slightly, you understand the logic instantly, because a single cow can radiate more heat than several people combined. The smell hits you next, rich and unmistakable, a mix of hay, manure, and warm fur, and while your modern instincts might recoil, your medieval brain files it under working solutions, because freezing politely is not an option. You adjust your position to account for the new presence, turning your face slightly away from the worst of the smell while appreciating the gentle rise in ambient warmth, a trade-off you accept without complaint. Historians still argue whether this close proximity increased disease or actually improved survival odds during winter. But lying here, feeling your toes slowly regain sensation, you suspect that short-term warmth often wins over long-term theory. The animals are not pets in the modern sense, but they are familiar, personalities you know well enough to read from sound alone. The impatient shuffle of a goat, the soft snort of a pig settling down, and these noises become part of your nighttime soundscape, oddly lulling. There's a quirky belief that animals sense cold spirits or bad weather before humans do, and when one stirs suddenly you tense for a moment, wondering if a storm is coming, before it settles again and you let the thought drift away. You remind yourself that animals survive winter too, and that by sheltering them, you're protecting future milk, labor, and food, a long-term investment that pays off when spring finally returns. Someone mutters half asleep about the cow taking up too much room, and you almost laugh, because winter turns everyone into reluctant roommates, negotiating space with creatures that outweigh you by several hundred pounds. The animal's breath adds moisture to the air, which helps a little with the dryness caused by the fire, though too much damp can be dangerous, so you're constantly balancing conditions without naming them, adjusting vents and doors instinctively. You notice how the animal's presence changes the room's energy, grounding it, making it feel more alive, less like a shelter and more like a shared ecosystem, humans and beasts weathering the same season together. There's straw everywhere, underfoot, under bodies, tucked into gaps for insulation, and it crackles softly as someone shifts, a reminder that bedding and fodder are often the same thing in winter, multitasking again, because resources are limited. A light joke floats through your mind about medieval central heating now mooing softly in the corner, and the absurdity almost makes you smile into the dark. You think about how later generations will separate animals from living spaces in the name of hygiene and comfort, and you wonder if they'll forget how intimate survival once was, how close you had to be to the sources of your food and labor to make it through nights like this. The warmth from the animals is not even or predictable. It comes in waves as they shift, and you learn to savor it when it's there, curling slightly toward it like a cat without realizing you're doing it. You're careful not to startle them, because a spooked animal in a confined space is dangerous, and winter injuries heal poorly, another unspoken rule you follow without needing to articulate it. Outside, the cold presses harder, wind rising, and you're quietly grateful for every extra degree the animals provide, knowing that, without them, the night would be longer and sharper. You remember a story about a family who lost their animals to disease before winter and never quite recovered, a reminder that warmth here is intertwined with livelihood, not just comfort. As the hours pass, the animals settle into deeper rest, their breathing slowing, sinking strangely with the humans around them, and the room reaches a fragile equilibrium, warm enough to sleep, not warm enough to forget where you are. You drift in and out of dreams accompanied by the soft sounds of life around you, hooves, breath, an occasional low murmur, and you realize that medieval winter survival is not a solitary act, but a collective one, humans and animals bound together by necessity. When you wake briefly to shift your numb shoulder, you register the warmth again and let yourself relax, accepting that tonight, at least, sharing your space with livestock is not a hardship, but a quiet, steaming gift against the cold. Hunger nudges you awake before the cold does, a dull ache in your belly reminding you that in winter, food is no longer about enjoyment or variety, but about feeding the furnace inside your body, because calories equal heat in a way you understand viscerally as you sit up and reach for whatever is left from last night's pot. You ladle out a thick stew, heavy with grains and maybe a few root vegetables, steam rising faintly, and you eat slowly, knowing that hot food warms you twice, once in the mouth and again as it settles. A mainstream truth medieval people rely on even if they don't phrase it in nutritional terms. Bread is dense and dark, not the airy loaves you might imagine, and you chew deliberately, appreciating how it fills you, because winter is no time for delicate appetites. Fat is prized now, dripping from meat when you have it, because fat burns long and steady, and you silently wish for more of it, aware that thin bodies lose heat faster, and winter is not kind to the underfed. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants experienced widespread winter starvation every year, or whether most years were merely lean and uncomfortable. But sitting here scraping the bowl clean, you feel how close those two states can be. You drink something warm, maybe small beer or thin ale, not because you're celebrating, but because it's safer than water and adds a bit of energy, and the warmth slides down, briefly banishing the chill from your chest. There's a quirky belief that certain foods carry warming or cooling properties beyond their temperature, and you notice how spices, rare as they are, feel almost magical in winter, a hint of heat that lingers longer than the fire's touch. You think about how meals shift in winter, becoming fewer but heavier, time to daylight and work because cooking costs fuel, and every stick of wood burned for food is one not burned for warmth later. You ration carefully, not counting calories, but counting days, because running out before spring is a fear that sits quietly in the back of your mind all season. Someone jokes weakly about dreaming of fresh fruit, and the humor is thin but appreciated, because imagining abundance helps distract from the monotony of winter fare. You notice how eating together boosts morale, bowls passed, bread broken, warmth shared, and you realize that food is as much psychological insulation as physical fuel. After the meal, your body relaxes slightly, blood shifting inward for digestion, and you feel a brief window of comfort, the kind that makes you sleepy if you're not careful, because winter work still needs doing, even after a cold night. You wrap up leftovers carefully, tucking them near the hearth to keep them from freezing solid, because frozen food is not always a blessing, sometimes turning edible things into inedible lumps. Outside, the day is pale and weak, and you prepare yourself mentally for limited daylight, knowing you'll need to eat again before night to face the cold, because going to bed hungry in winter is an invitation for misery. You reflect on how modern people talk about comfort food, and you almost laugh, because here, all food is comfort food by default, every bite a small act of defiance against the season. As you finish eating, warmth radiating outward, you feel better equipped to face another stretch of cold, understanding deeply that surviving medieval winter nights begins long before you lie down, with what you put into your body and how carefully you stretch it. As night falls again, you notice that the cold is no longer the only thing pressing in on you, because winter also stretches the darkness until it feels almost physical. A heavy blanket laid over the world, and without candles to spare or oil to waste, you surrender to it earlier than you would like, learning that medieval nights are not meant to be conquered but endured. You sit quietly, listening, because there is little else to do once the work is finished, and you feel how the long hours of darkness pull at your thoughts, slowing them, thickening them, making worries echo louder than they do in daylight. It's a mainstream historical understanding that winter nights are significantly longer before artificial lighting, and you feel that truth keenly as time seems to stretch, each hour feeling like two, your sense of rhythm guided more by fatigue than clocks. Historians still argue whether medieval people slept in one long stretch or in segmented sleep with a waking period in between. And as you drift off, then surface again a few hours later, staring into the dim glow of embers, you realize that your own body seems undecided, pulled between exhaustion and restlessness. The cold keeps you alert even in sleep, a low-level tension that never fully releases, and you wake easily, checking the fire, listening for changes, because winter trains you to stay half awake, ready to respond. Thoughts wander in the dark, circling the same topics again and again: food stores, health, the weather, and you understand how winter feeds anxiety, how the mind fills silence with imagined futures when the world offers no distractions. There's a quirky belief that excessive thinking at night invites bad dreams or spirits, and you try to focus instead on simple things, counting breaths, listening to the wind, grounding yourself in sound and sensation. Someone nearby sighs or mutters in their sleep, and you feel a small comfort in not being alone with your thoughts, because solitude is louder in winter than company. You notice how stories become important in this season, tales told earlier in the evening, replaying in your mind, because narrative fills time when action cannot, and you silently thank whoever told them for giving your thoughts somewhere to rest. There's a faint joke you make to yourself about medieval people inventing bedtime overthinking centuries before smartphones, and the humor takes the edge off your spiraling thoughts. You consider how darkness changes perception, making the house feel smaller and larger at the same time. Walls close, the outside world infinite and unknowable, and you understand why winter is fertile ground for superstition. Your body cools as the fire dims, and the cold nudges your thoughts back toward the present, reminding you that mental wandering has limits when physical survival is at stake. You adjust your layers, tuck yourself closer to warmth, and try to settle again, because sleep is still necessary, even if it comes in fragments. The night passes in waves, half dreams, half waking moments, and you learn to accept this pattern, understanding that winter rest is not about deep, uninterrupted sleep, but about collecting enough of it to function. As dawn finally hints at its return, pale and weak, you feel relief, not because the cold is gone, but because the darkness loosens its grip, and you realize that surviving medieval winter nights is as much about enduring the long mental stretch as it is about staying warm, about keeping your thoughts from freezing along with your body. When you finally make your way back to your sleeping place, you become acutely aware that medieval beds are less about luxury and more about engineering warmth, and you lower yourself onto a structure designed to trap heat, conserve energy, and keep you just far enough from the cold ground to survive another night. The bed is simple, often a wooden frame or even just a raised platform, because elevation matters here. Cold air sinking, while warmer air hovers slightly higher, a mainstream historical principle understood through lived experience rather than diagrams. Beneath you is a mattress stuffed with straw, chaff, or dried leaves, materials chosen not for softness, but for insulation, and as they compress under your weight, they release faint, earthy smells that remind you this bed was once part of a field. Historians still argue whether straw mattresses were replaced often enough to be hygienic, or whether people simply endured the discomfort. But tonight, hygiene is not your primary concern. Warmth is, and the mattress does its job well enough. You pull blankets over yourself, heavy wool layers that press down like a gentle weight, limiting movement, but also sealing in precious heat. And you realize that medieval bedding is intentionally restrictive because tossing and turning lets warmth escape. There's a quirky belief that sleeping too loosely allows bad air to circulate around the body, so you tuck yourself in tightly, whether from superstition or instinct. You're not entirely sure. The bed curtains, if you're lucky enough to have them, form a fabric tent around you, trapping warmth and blocking drafts. And as you pull them closed, you feel the temperature rise almost immediately, a small miracle born of simple physics. You think about how these curtained beds also create privacy in shared spaces, though in winter their primary function is clearly thermal, and you silently thank whoever thought to hang cloth around a sleeping person like a human thermos. You arrange your body carefully, knees slightly bent, arms tucked in, a posture that minimizes exposed surface area, and you smile faintly at how your body has learned these strategies without formal teaching. There's a light joke in your mind about medieval burrito-style sleeping, and it almost makes you laugh, though you stifle it to avoid waking anyone else. The fire is low now, embers glowing softly, and you rely more on your bed's design than on the hearth, because the night's deepest cold often comes just before dawn. You notice how the straw mattress creaks softly as you shift, and you remind yourself not to move too much, because every movement pumps warm air out and invites cold in, a lesson learned through many restless nights. Outside, the wind presses against the walls, but inside the bed's small enclosed world, the sound is muffled, softened, and you feel briefly insulated not just from cold, but from the vastness of winter itself. You think about how beds like this appear in illustrations and records, surprisingly elaborate compared to other furniture. And you understand now why people invested in them, because a good bed is not a luxury in winter, but a survival tool. Your feet are the slowest to warm, always, and you rub them together gently under the blankets, coaxing circulation back, because numbness there makes sleep shallow and restless. You remember a tale of someone stuffing heated stones or wrapped embers into beds, a risky practice that sometimes works and sometimes burns holes through everything, and you decide tonight is not the night to gamble. Historians still debate how common such practices were, but the stories alone are enough to make you cautious, because fire and bedding are a dangerous combination. The weight of the blankets grows comforting, pressing you into the mattress, and your breathing slows, sinking with the small warm pocket you've created. You feel cocooned, separated from the cold by layers of wood, straw, wool, and habit, and for a moment you forget how harsh the world outside is. You think about how modern beds prioritize softness and space, while medieval ones prioritize containment and heat, and you wonder which design is truly more honest about what sleep is for. As the night deepens, you drift into a deeper rest, your body finally convinced that it can afford to let go a little, trusting the bed to hold warmth long enough. When you wake briefly, as you inevitably do, you're relieved to find the warmth still there, trapped faithfully around you, and you settle back in, grateful for this humble, well-used construction that turns sleep from a gamble into a strategy. In this narrow, bundled stillness, you understand that medieval beds are not places of escape, but of defense, small forts built from everyday materials. And tonight, they stand between you and the cold just long enough to make survival possible. As winter settles into its deepest routine, you realize that surviving the coldest nights is no longer just an individual effort, but a communal one, because the village itself becomes a kind of shared shelter, each household leaning subtly on the others through habits, customs, and unspoken agreements that only really matter when temperatures drop and daylight feels scarce. You gather when you can, not necessarily to celebrate, but to synchronize, sharing news about weather signs, food stores, and who might need help, because information in winter is warmth in another form. There's a mainstream historical truth that medieval villages operate on tight-knit cooperation, especially in harsh seasons, and you feel that cooperation in the way people check in on one another without fuss, noticing who looks thinner, who coughs too often, who hasn't been seen since the last snowfall. Historians still argue whether this communal structure is born primarily of necessity or tradition, but standing here in the dim light, listening to familiar voices, it feels like both at once, a system reinforced by survival itself. Winter rituals take on added weight now, simple gatherings by the fire, shared meals on certain nights, storytelling that stretches longer than usual, because these moments push back against the cold's attempt to isolate everyone. You notice how stories shift with the season, focusing on endurance, clever escapes, and eventual return, narratives that quietly reassure you that winter has been survived before and will be survived again. There's a quirky belief that certain nights are luckier than others for sharing warmth or food, tied to saints' days or older calendar markers, and even if you don't fully buy into it, you follow along, because doing so connects you to the group, and that connection itself feels protective. You take turns hosting small gatherings, not lavish but warm, everyone bringing what they can spare, and you feel the room heat up with bodies and conversation, a noticeable difference that makes you linger a little longer before heading back into the cold. Someone cracks a joke about winter lasting forever, and it earns a tired laugh because humor becomes sharper and more necessary now, cutting through fatigue like a blade. You think about how modern people might call this mutual aid, and you smile at the idea that medieval peasants have been practicing it quietly for centuries without needing a name. Children are included in these gatherings, not sent away, because winter is when knowledge passes hands to ears most efficiently, stories teaching them what to fear, what to respect, and how to endure. Elders speak more often now, their memories of past winters suddenly valuable, cautionary tales and small tips surfacing that might make the difference between comfort and danger. You notice how the community responds quickly to absence, how a missing light or an unopened door prompts concern, because in winter, silence can mean trouble. There's a quiet understanding that no one survives alone, not for long, and that stepping in early is better than mourning later. You help repair a neighbor's door, patch a wall, share straw or firewood, small acts that feel heavy with importance when the cold presses hardest. Historians still debate how widespread such cooperation truly was versus competition for resources, but your lived experience suggests that winter punishes selfishness quickly, making collaboration the more reliable strategy. There's a light, weary joke you tell yourself about medieval social calendars being weather-dependent, and it makes you grin as you shake snow from your cloak before stepping inside another warm room. Faith rituals blend seamlessly into these communal moments, prayers said together not just for spiritual comfort, but because spoken words feel warmer when shared, and you notice how voices steady each other in the cold air. You listen to the rhythm of village life slow down, workdays shorter, nights longer, and you adapt your expectations accordingly, accepting that winter demands patience rather than productivity. The cold still finds you later, back in your own home, but it feels less overwhelming now, buffered by the knowledge that others are enduring the same thing at the same time, a shared experience that dulls fear's edge. As you settle in for another night, you carry fragments of laughter, stories, and warmth with you, intangible but real, and you understand that medieval peasants survived the coldest nights not just by insulating their bodies, but by weaving themselves into a community tight enough to hold when winter tries to pull everyone apart. By now you understand that winter is not just uncomfortable, but dangerous, because cold has a way of amplifying every weakness in the body, and as you wake to another gray morning, you feel it in stiff joints, in a throat that feels slightly raw, in the lingering fatigue that no amount of sleep quite fixes. Illness moves differently in winter, slower but more persistent, settling in and refusing to leave, and you've learned to watch for the signs in yourself and others, because catching sickness early can mean the difference between recovery and decline. There is a mainstream historical understanding that medieval winters see spikes in respiratory illness, and as you hear someone nearby cough deeply, you feel a familiar knot of concern, knowing how quickly a simple chill can turn into something more serious when warmth and nutrition are limited. You wrap yourself tighter, instinctively, because cold feels personal now, like an adversary looking for openings, and you do what you can to keep your body defended. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood contagion in any meaningful way, but you know from experience that closeness can spread illness as easily as warmth, a cruel trade-off in winter when separation is not an option. You notice how the sick are positioned closest to the fire, given thicker blankets, extra broth, small adjustments that feel enormous when resources are stretched, and you silently approve of these priorities, because winter forces hard choices about who needs help most urgently. There's a quirky belief that illness enters through the feet or the back of the neck, and you find yourself paying extra attention to those areas, double wrapping scarves, stuffing more straw into shoes, because belief and practicality blur when fear is involved. You remember stories of people who seemed fine one night and gone a few days later, the cold stealing strength quietly, and those memories linger longer in winter, shaping how seriously you take every ache. Someone suggests a remedy, herbs steeped in hot water, prayers murmured over a bowl, and while you don't expect miracles, you appreciate the effort, because doing something feels better than helpless waiting. There's a light, bitter joke you think, but don't say about winter being the ultimate stress test for the human body, and you suppress it, because humor around sickness feels riskier than humor around cold. You notice how work slows when illness spreads, tasks postponed, expectations adjusted, because pushing too hard can break someone completely, and winter does not forgive overexertion. Children are watched closely, elders even more so, because their bodies struggle hardest to maintain heat, and you feel a protective urgency that sharpens your awareness of every shiver, every flushed cheek. You think about how death in winter feels both sudden and expected, a grim paradox, and you understand why medieval people talk about it more openly during this season, because pretending it isn't near doesn't make it so. Historians still debate mortality rates across different medieval winters, but lived experience teaches you that the cold narrows the margin for error, making small mistakes costly. You burn extra fuel for the sick despite the worry it brings, because warmth now is worth more than hypothetical warmth later, and this calculation weighs on you heavily as the firewood pile shrinks. You notice how silence changes when someone is ill, conversations softer, movements more deliberate, the house holding its breath along with you. There's a strange clarity winter illness brings, stripping life down to basics, warmth, food, rest, and you realize how little else matters when survival is at stake. You stay alert through the night, waking often, checking on breathing, adjusting blankets, because winter care is hands-on and constant, not something you delegate and forget. When dawn comes, pale and cold, and everyone is still alive, you feel a small, quiet victory, the kind winter hands out sparingly. You understand now that surviving medieval winter nights is not just about keeping yourself warm, but about shepherding fragile bodies through weeks of cold, knowing that some will falter despite your best efforts. As you lie back down, exhausted but relieved, you accept that winter does not just test strength, but compassion, asking again and again how much you are willing to give to keep others breathing until spring. Night settles in again, and with it comes a quieter kind of cold, the sort that creeps into your thoughts as much as your limbs, because winter does not only chill the body, it stretches belief, pressing on faith and superstition until they blur together into something you lean on whether you mean to or not. You murmur familiar prayers as you bank the fire, words learned so early they feel almost physical, like another layer wrapped around your mind, and even if you don't expect immediate answers, saying them out loud steadies you, giving shape to the fear that otherwise rattles around in silence. It's a mainstream historical reality that medieval life is deeply infused with religion, and winter nights amplify this, because darkness invites questions that daylight keeps at bay. You notice how crosses, charms, and small tokens suddenly feel more important after sunset, especially when the wind howls just right, making the house creak in ways that sound uncomfortably intentional. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly believed every superstition they practiced, or whether many rituals were simply habits shaped by fear and tradition. But as you touch a worn charm near your bed, the distinction feels academic at best. There's a quirky belief that winter nights belong to wandering spirits, souls caught between worlds by the cold, and while you wouldn't admit it openly, you're careful not to whistle after dark or speak certain names aloud, because provoking the unknown feels unnecessary when survival already asks so much of you. The fire's glow throws shadows that stretch and shrink unpredictably, and you find yourself watching them longer than you intend, your mind half filling in shapes that aren't really there, because imagination gets bolder when the world is reduced to flickering light and sound. You hear someone tell a half-remembered story about a traveler lost to the cold, guided astray by strange lights, and even though you know it's meant as a warning more than a truth, the image sticks, because winter has a way of making metaphors feel literal. You pull your blankets tighter, not just for warmth, but for reassurance, because enclosure feels protective in more ways than one, and you understand why medieval beds often resemble nests or cocoons. Faith offers structure here, marking nights with meaning, reminding you that winter has a place in a larger cycle, and you cling to that idea when the cold feels endless. You think about saints associated with protection, with travelers, with illness, their names surfacing more often in winter conversations, because people need intermediaries when the world feels harsh and impersonal. There's a light, self-aware joke in your head about medieval anxiety needing a supernatural explanation long before psychology exists, and it almost makes you smile, though you keep it to yourself. You notice how fear is quieter when shared, how murmured prayers spoken together carry more weight than those whispered alone, and you find comfort in the sound of familiar voices nearby, grounding you in the present. The cold sharpens every creak and rustle, and you train yourself to distinguish between normal night sounds and something truly wrong, because panic wastes energy you can't spare. You remember being told that winter is when the boundary between life and death feels thinnest, and you feel that truth now, not as terror, but as heightened awareness, a reminder to be careful, deliberate, and kind. As the night deepens, your thoughts slow, prayers trailing off into half-formed hopes, and you let belief carry you where certainty cannot, trusting that morning will come because it always has before. Wrapped in wool and ritual, you settle into sleep again, knowing that faith and superstition, however irrational they might seem later, form another kind of insulation, one that keeps the mind from freezing when the body already struggles. By this point in winter, you've learned that cold is not the same everywhere, and as you listen to stories drifting through the village, you become aware that geography quietly decides how harsh survival will be, drawing invisible lines between those who merely endure winter and those who fight it tooth and nail every night. You imagine peasants farther north, where snow piles high against doors and daylight all but disappears, and you feel a strange mix of relief and humility because your own nights are brutal enough without adding weeks of deeper cold. It's a mainstream historical understanding that medieval winters vary dramatically by region, shaped by latitude, altitude, and proximity to the sea, and you feel that truth when travelers describe conditions that sound almost unreal compared to your own. Historians still argue how much climate alone versus social structure determine survival rates, but you sense that both matter deeply because cold is always harsher when resources are thin. In coastal areas, damp winds cut through layers more viciously than dry cold ever could, and you imagine that creeping chill, the kind that settles into joints and refuses to leave, making every night feel slightly worse than the last. Inland, winters might be clearer and sharper, cold that bites hard but retreats more predictably, and you understand how different kinds of cold teach different survival habits, shaping routines and expectations. There's a quirky belief that certain lands are cursed with harsher winters because of ancient sins or restless spirits, and while you don't fully buy into it, you notice how people use these stories to explain suffering that otherwise feels unfair. You hear about mountain communities where homes are built lower, tighter, roofs steeper to shed snow, and you realize how architecture itself becomes a response to geography, a silent adaptation passed down through generations. You think about how those in milder regions might judge others for crowding animals indoors or sleeping packed together, unaware that what seems excessive in one climate is essential in another. There's a light joke you make to yourself about winter being medieval Europe's version of a regional personality test, and it helps you frame the differences without resentment. You also notice inequality within your own region, wealthier households able to burn more fuel, eat more fat, wear thicker wool, while poorer ones rely even more heavily on community and luck. And this disparity feels sharper in winter when comfort becomes survival. Historians still debate whether winter widened social gaps or temporarily narrowed them through shared hardship. But watching how people redistribute resources when cold tightens its grip, you suspect the answer shifts year by year. You hear about southern areas where winters are shorter but wetter, where mold and rot pose as much danger as frost, and you appreciate that every climate carries its own quiet threats. Children raised in harsher regions seem tougher somehow, acclimated early to discomfort, and you wonder whether resilience is learned or inherited, a question winter does not wait for you to answer. You notice how regional winter customs differ too. certain foods reserved for cold months, specific songs or sayings meant to coax spring closer, and you feel connected to a wider human pattern, each place adapting in its own way. There's a story about a traveler who misjudged a region's winter and paid dearly for it, a cautionary tale that reminds you how local knowledge is as important as strength. You reflect on how modern people talk about weather abstractly, as inconvenience or spectacle, and you feel a quiet frustration at how little that language captures what winter truly means here. As night falls again, you prepare with the confidence of experience, aware that your winter is not the worst possible but still demanding respect, and you settle into familiar routines with a steadiness that wasn't there at the season's start. You understand now that medieval peasants survived the coldest nights, not because winter is kind, but because they adapt relentlessly to where they are, shaping their lives around cold rather than trying to conquer it. And as you drift towards sleep, you feel a strange gratitude for knowing your landscape so well. Because in winter, belonging to a place can mean the difference between endurance and despair. As winter grinds on, your attention shifts more and more toward the smallest and weakest bodies around you, because cold is cruelly selective, and you see how children and elders feel it first and hardest, their warmth harder to maintain, their energy quicker to drain. You watch a child sleep, curled tightly, breath shallow and fast, and you instinctively pull a blanket higher, because you know their smaller frame loses heat faster, a mainstream historical reality that medieval families understand without charts or thermometers. Elders sit closer to the fire, hands extended, skin thin and papery, joints stiff with cold, and you notice how they move less now, conserving strength, because winter teaches restraint to those who have learned its lessons before. Historians still argue whether medieval families prioritized the young over the old in times of scarcity, but in your lived experience, care flows toward whoever seems most fragile in the moment, regardless of age, because winter does not respect hierarchy. You help dress children in extra layers, clumsy bundles of wool and linen, and you smile faintly at how they complain about itchiness just like adults do, because discomfort is universal even when necessity explains it. Elders share stories by the fire, voices slower now, memories stretching back to winters worse than this one, and you listen carefully, because these recollections are not nostalgia but instruction, reminders of what worked when cold nearly won. There's a quirky belief that elders carry a kind of warmth in their words, that listening to them wards off winter's bite, and while you wouldn't phrase it that way, you do notice how their stories calm the room, lowering tension, making the cold feel slightly less sharp. You adjust sleeping arrangements, placing children between adults, elders shielded from drafts, bodies arranged with care like pieces in a puzzle where the goal is simply to make it through the night. You feel the weight of responsibility more keenly now, because winter turns care into a constant vigilance, and even small lapses feel dangerous. There's a light, tired joke you think about winter turning everyone into a full-time caretaker, and it almost makes you laugh before exhaustion pulls the humor flat. You notice how illness lingers longer in these bodies, how recovery takes patience, and you ration warmth and food with this in mind, slipping extra broth into a child's bowl, offering the best seat by the fire to someone whose hands shake. Historians still debate how medieval societies conceptualize childhood and old age, but here, in the cold, those categories blur into a single concern, vulnerability, and you respond to it instinctively. You remember a winter long ago when a neighbor lost an elder quietly in the night, the cold stealing breath without drama, and the memory sharpens your attention now, making you check breathing, adjust blankets, wake lightly to listen. Children sense the tension even if they don't understand it fully, becoming quieter at night, clinging more during the day, and you offer reassurance where you can, because fear wastes energy they cannot spare. You think about how modern heating flattens these differences, how warmth on demand hides the body's fragility, and you feel a strange respect for how exposed life feels here, every age group revealing its limits under winter's pressure. Elders speak of spring often now, not as certainty, but as hope, and you notice how children pick up that language, asking questions about lambs and green shoots, because imagining warmth helps carry them through cold. You tuck everyone in again, night after night, repeating the same motions, because routine itself becomes comforting, a signal that someone is watching, someone cares. There's a soft satisfaction in seeing a child's flushed cheeks return to normal, in hearing an elder's breathing even out, small victories that feel outsized in winter's economy. As you settle down yourself, you accept that protecting the vulnerable costs energy you barely have, but you also understand that this effort binds families together, reinforcing why survival is not just about individual strength. In the quiet, after the fire dims, you listen to the layered breathing around you, young and old intertwined, and you feel the weight of winter press less heavily for a moment, because caring for others gives purpose to endurance. And as sleep finally takes you, you know that if spring does come, it will arrive carried on the backs of nights like this, nights where warmth is shared deliberately, and no one is left to face the cold alone. By now, winter feels endless, not because it truly is, but because hope thins when cold repeats itself night after night, and you catch yourself scanning the world obsessively for signs of change, for anything that suggests the season might loosen its grip before it finishes wearing you down. You listen more closely to the wind, noticing when it shifts direction, softer somehow, carrying a different weight, and you wonder if that means anything or if you're simply desperate to believe it does. There is a mainstream historical understanding that medieval people track seasonal change through natural cues rather than calendars, and you do the same, watching how frost forms on the ground, how long it lingers after sunrise, how animals behave when daylight stretches by even a few precious minutes. Historians still argue whether peasants truly believed spring was guaranteed, or whether each winter carried a quiet fear that it might not end kindly. And as you lie awake listening to the cold test your walls again, you realize the truth probably lives somewhere in between hope and resignation. You remember winters spoken of in hushed tones, seasons when thaw came too late, crops failed, bodies weakened beyond recovery, and those stories hover in your mind now, making every cold night feel like a question mark rather than a countdown. Still, you cling to routine, because routine suggests continuity, and continuity implies survival, so you bank the fire the same way, layer your clothes the same way, settle into your bed with the same careful movements, trusting repetition more than optimism. There's a quirky belief that certain days mark winter's turning point, moments when the sun begins its slow return, and even if you can't see the difference yet, you mark them quietly, letting the idea warm you in advance. You talk about spring more often now, not loudly, not as celebration, but as acknowledgement, mentioning fields that will need tending, repairs that can wait no longer, plans postponed until warmth returns, because speaking of the future is its own act of defiance. There's a light joke you think about winter overstaying its welcome like an awkward guest, and the image almost makes you smile, because humor helps you imagine an ending when experience refuses to promise one. You notice subtle changes in yourself too, how your body has adapted, tolerating cold that once felt unbearable, conserving energy more efficiently, reacting faster to drops in temperature, and you realize winter reshapes you even as you resist it. Nights are still cold, brutally so, but they feel slightly less shocking now, because familiarity dulls fear, and you settle in, knowing exactly where warmth will come from and where it will not. You think about how medieval peasants measure time not in months, but in survival milestones. Another week endured, another night passed without illness or accident, and you quietly count those victories, even if you never name them aloud. Historians still debate whether medieval people experienced winter with dread or acceptance, but lying here, half awake, you feel both braided together, dread of what could still go wrong, and acceptance of what must be endured regardless. The fire crackles softly, embers glowing, and you imagine the earth beneath frozen fields beginning to loosen its grip, roots stirring, seeds waiting patiently, because thinking about life continuing elsewhere makes the cold feel less absolute. You notice animals behaving differently too, restless at night, shifting more often, as if they sense something changing before you do, and you take that as a small comfort, because animals are honest about the weather in a way people rarely are. You reflect on how modern forecasts promise exact dates and temperatures, and you almost laugh at the contrast, because here, uncertainty is constant, and endurance grows from learning to live with it. Sleep comes and goes in fragments, but when you wake, you feel something new alongside fatigue, a quiet stubbornness, a refusal to let winter define the end of your story. You remember the earliest nights of the season, how sharp and frightening they felt, and you recognize how far you've come since then, not stronger in the heroic sense, but steadier, more practiced, less surprised. There's comfort in that, in knowing that even if spring is delayed, you are no longer meeting winter unprepared, because every cold night survived has taught you something useful. As you pull your blanket tighter and settle once more, you allow yourself to imagine the first true thaw, the smell of wet earth, the sound of water moving freely again, not as fantasy, but as something earned through patience. The cold still presses in, still demands respect, but it no longer feels infinite, and that shift, subtle and fragile, is enough to carry you through another night. You drift towards sleep, holding that thought gently, aware that spring is hoped for, never promised, but survival itself is proof that hope, however quiet, is sometimes justified.